Hello and good evening, everyone. Wishing everyone a very, very happy new year. We're excited to have you all here this evening for this presentation of New York City's forgotten jazz age best-selling author, Ursula Parrott, with Marcia Gordon. Before we dive into that, if you are unfamiliar with village preservation, just a quick little introduction about village preservation. We've been around since 1980, and we've been documenting, protecting, and highlighting the history and the culture of Greenwich Village, the West Village, East Village, and NoHo. And we do this through 75 different free programs that are usually open to the public. So please go ahead and take a look on your screen there, and you will see that QR code. Go ahead, scan that QR code. You'll be able to donate to us. We could always use your support. We are a member-based organization, but you can also learn a heck of a lot more about village preservation and all the work that we've done, which includes protecting over 1,250 buildings in our neighborhoods and zoning protections for over 100 blocks in the neighborhoods as well. If you're interested in learning more about our programs, head to villagepreservation.org. And just to give you a highlight of what we have still coming up here in January, we've got Radicals and Rogues, the women who made New York modern, with Lottie Whalen this coming Thursday. And next Wednesday, with our partner, the Merchant's House Museum, we are doing Edgar Allan Poe, The Man, the Mystery, and the Legend. So please make sure to head over to villagepreservation.org to learn more about these programs and all of the amazing work that we do. But now to introduce this evening's speaker, we're joined by Marcia Gordon. She's a professor of film studies at North Carolina State University and a past fellow at the National Humanities Center and a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. She's the author of numerous books and articles and the co-director of several award-winning short documentaries. And tonight she's going to be speaking on her most recent book, Becoming the Ex-Wife: The Unconventional Life and Forgotten Writings of Ursula Parrott. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Marcia. Welcome. We're so excited to have you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much, William. Let me get my PowerPoint on the screen so everybody can see it. And
all right, with that, I will disappear into the shadows.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for tuning in this evening for my talk. As William just told you, I've recently published this biography about a once very famous and prolific author who was widely adapted in Hollywood and who has, until very recently, been totally erased from cultural memory. You might say she's in need of a little historic preservation or maybe rehabilitation herself. So Ursula Parrott spent her adult life in New York City, and she sent many of her stories. I don't know if I should say there or here. I'm assuming most of you are in New York. I am not, but we're sharing the same storm tonight. Almost 50 of her short stories and serialized novels were set in New York, as were many of her 20 books. And I did a quick mapping out of all of the places that that Parrott lived while she, that I have documentation of through her correspondence. Some of these places were short-term and some of them were long-term. She eventually had a country home in Connecticut, not far outside of the city. And so it is very, she would come in and stay at, hotels like the New Westin or the Algonquin when she needed to work. So, but this just gives you a sense of kind of the terrain she was traveling during her time in New York. Okay, so this evening, I am going to be focusing on Ursula Parrott's life and storytelling about New York City and especially Greenwich Village. But first, I need to tell you a little bit about where she came from and why people should know more about her. The future Ursula Parrott was born Catherine Ursula Towle in Boston in 1899 to Irish Catholic parents. She attended the Boston Latin Girls' School and graduated with a BA in English from Radcliffe in 1920. So she was really fortunate that she was raised in a region that was really at the vanguard of women's education and of having parents who had really progressive educational beliefs. So if you sent your daughter to Boston Latin Girls' School, you were expected to send her to college if she wanted to go. Later in life, she recalled, all my youth in Boston, I looked forward to going to live in Greenwich Village, where one was clever and gay and young and talked about things that mattered instead of church and successful marriage and the babies people had or didn't have. It's a little bit of the devilish Ursula coming out there. So this was a place that she thought about as she was coming of age and getting a little more rebellious. While working her first post-college job as an unbylined newspaper reporter, she attended a Princeton University prom, where she met a fellow student and an aspiring reporter named Lindsay Mark Parrott, who would soon move to New York City for his first job as a cub reporter. Lindsay often took Kitty, that was her nickname, on dates in Greenwich Village. One night, she recalled, when it was getting dark, Lindsay took me to dinner at the Pirate's Den, which was located on Christopher Street in a former stable that was renovated to look like a ship's deck on each of its 3 floors. I wish it was still there. I couldn't eat, she recalled. Everyone looked absolutely clever and beautiful and gay and young, as if they were going to pop out with a perfect sonnet instantly, which I think is as delightful a description of a doe-eyed newcomer to the city as one could hope for. So the adult chapter of Parrott's life really begins with a bold decision, which was to abandon graduate study at Radcliffe, which she was on the verge of undertaking, to accept Lindsay's marriage proposal. On August 31st, 1922, a Roman Catholic priest performed their nuptials at the Church of St. Anthony of Padua in Greenwich Village. Lindsay was newly 21 and she was 23, although she shaved a year off her age on their marriage certificate, which she took increasing years off of her age over the years, but as did many women at the time. The groom listed his occupation, as you can see here on their certificate and record of marriage, as a newspaper reporter. But note that there is no equivalent space for the bride to report a profession, only a maiden name if a widow. And one of the things I love about these historic documents is they tell us a lot about the culture and the expectations of a given time. And so clearly women having a profession was not among those. So following their wedding, Lindsay and Kitty moved into a brownstone at 25 Charlton Street, 5 blocks south of Washington Square Park, and began what was to be their complicated and short marital life together. And the Reader's Digest version of what followed is that the couple had a son, Mark Dudley Parrott, in 1923. And after Mark's birth, the couple rented what she described as an enormous 6-room apartment in a very rundown area of Chelsea at 336 West 19th Street, no longer so rundown. There were infidelities and fights, and the couple went through a difficult and long separation that ended in divorce in 1928. And obviously, there's a lot more going on here, but that's what biographies are for, right? So Ursula Parrott found herself a late 20-something divorcee with a child and herself to support. And so she had that college education, so she got a job writing advertisements for a department store, and one of those was Bloomingdale's on Lexington. This was fairly well compensated work, and she had a series of epiphanies in this line of work. One was that she had thought that she was all alone in being a divorced mother of a young son, having to figure out how to work and take care of herself. But when she started looking around her, she realized there were a lot of divorcees, a lot of them also trying to raise children on their own. So she was not alone. The second thing she realized is that she really didn't like the work. She thought it was trite and exhausting and unstimulating. But the third thing she learned was that she was a pretty good writer. So she started writing a book, which was an only slightly fictionalized version of her travails to date. And it was anonymously published in 1929 as Ex-Wife. And it changed the course of her truly overnight. I know that's a concept that gets thrown around and abused a lot, but it really happened that quickly for her. Note that the anonymous was a marketing gimmick. Of course, if you say that a book is being published anonymously, that must mean that you're protecting the author's identity because it's, so salacious. But her name was attached to the book before the book even really came out. So it was a very short-lived marketing stunt. A tale from the trenches of infidelity, divorce, dating, and remarriage in boozy, dissipated Manhattan. Ex-Wife is a fascinating and very frank novel about infidelities committed by both a husband and a wife, about spousal conflict and the double standard, about women navigating the logistics of postmarital life. Ex-Wife is a confessional, tweaking a Catholic tradition beyond recognition, which is written from Patricia's point of view as her marriage to Peter falls apart and she transitions into life as an ex-wife. The novel has really rich details about young women's working and social lives in New York City, but it also describes harrowing experiences for its female protagonist, which include domestic abuse, rape, and abortion. And I think these things are really important because they're really absent in a lot of the literature of this period, written kind of sympathetically from a woman's perspective. And so this is really unique. So those of you who are up on your Greenwich Village and Manhattan history, and I suspect many of you are, will be interested to know that in Ex-Wife, Parrott's characters hang out at the Brevoort, Giacomo's Bar, Child's, the Waldorf, Delano's, and Dante's, which I went and had a drink at when I was in town doing talks in October, where her characters drink Clover Clubs, martinis, scotch, Tom Collins's, Alexander's, and brandy flips. Parrott really richly details her novels and stories, and she did this from the start. And I love this cheap 1940s Dell Mapback edition of Ex-Wife that I have up on the screen here. As you see, it actually maps out the locations of the various places that the characters navigate in over the course of the novel. Parrott's love for New York really comes out in this book, even if her realization that the city even if it comes with the realization that the city had its share of traps as well. There's a really great description of the city, which is, New York's a jail to which, once committed, the sentence is for life. But it is such a well-furnished jail, one does not mind much, which I think is a really beautiful way to phrase that. I'm going to read two other short excerpts from Ex-Wife to give you a sense of what a snapshot of life in Jazz Age Manhattan it is. And these are almost kind of randomly picked from the book. One is, this is from the main character, Patricia's point of view as she's dating. He took me to art exhibits, concerts and concerts and concerts, beer gardens where the Kapellmeister alternated the hilarity of Ei de Schöne Schnitzelbank with the poignancy of Nur eine Nacht. He took me to the only Chinese restaurant on Pell Street, where the chef had been trained to cook for a Mandarin. He took me 10 blocks out of our way to dinner to show me the design on the wrought iron doors of a new building on Madison Avenue, and to the Lido and Montmartre to dance, and to Pierre's to lunch, and to speakeasies, where he who had never seen France moistened the labels of cognac bottles, hopefully, to see if the Hennessy watermark showed through. Just great details, right? And especially if you're trying to retrace and think about places in New York that are no longer there. Another one. This is my favorite chapter in the book. This is where she's talking to her roommate, Lucia, about a gift she got of a phonograph for her birthday, which was Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. And they talk about playing this over and over again. We turned that on about once an hour when we came home. The tune matches New York, Lucia said, the New York we know. It has gaiety and color and irrelevancy and futility and glamour as beautifully blended as the ingredients in crepe Suzette. I said, it makes me think of skyscrapers and Harlem and liners sailing and newsboys calling extras. It makes me think I'm 20 years old and on the way to owning the city, Lucia said. Start it over again, will you? And within this chapter, she actually includes the bars from Rhapsody in Blue, the musical notes. And so those are peppered throughout the chapter as she's kind of creating a sonic atmosphere for her readers, which I think is really cool. I think this is one of the great novels of New York City, and a lot of other people did when it came out as well. It was a sensation and a bestseller, and Ursula Parrott got her first big paycheck in October of 1929. Um, if you look at that headline from the New York Daily Mirror, dated October 29th, also known as Black Tuesday, you'll read that all caps headline of 9 billion lost, Morgan deserts market. Look at the bottom of the page. Ex-wife is thrown out in storm. The New York Daily Mirror was serializing Parrott's novel when the stock market crashed, which is just extraordinary. In their review of the book from 1929, the New York Times credited Parrott with creating the category of the ex-wife, which they described as a new descriptive tag to the American language. Now, Parrott did not make up the term ex-wife, but she really gave it teeth, and it became a thing because of her book. Parrott invigorated the descriptor at a moment of widespread curiosity about what was happening to society in an age of marital impermanence. I suspect this audience will be interested to know that Ex-Wife earned a place on the shelf at Lee Chumley's Speakeasy on Bedford Street, one of Parrott's regular haunts, as did a parodic book that came out in the aftermath of her book's success. It was called Ex-Husband. By the way, her book was so successful that it inspired numerous imitations. There was Ex-Mistress, Ex-It, and my favorite, Ex-Baby, which begins, "I had a wonderful time while it lasted." Now, not everyone admired Parrott's novel and its of-the-moment observations. It was accused by one critic of being sensationalistic Greenwich Village art, shot through with literary pretense. Sorry, villagers. Parrott would not have known that her book was, on at least one occasion, deemed unfit even for description. When Louis Gannett of the New York Herald Tribune attempted to summarize the story of Ex-Wife in his review, he so shocked the newspaper's veteran copy editor that this was the only time that his copy was ever censored. So when I started to research Ursula Parrott, Ex-Wife had been out of print for a long time, and I had to buy it on eBay, as I had to all of her books. But I'm very happy to report that McNally Editions republished Ex-Wife a week after my biography came out last year. And Alyssa Bennett wrote a really lovely introduction to the book. Faber recently announced that it purchased international rights. So it's going to be translated into German, Italian, Dutch, Swedish, and Spanish, which I'm thrilled about. It's really a fantastic read. And I think all of you on this webinar would really enjoy it. You can go to your local McNally shop and pick up a copy. So from the late 1920s through the late 1940s, Ursula Parrott used her writing to explore what she called maxims in the copybook of modernism, exploring the double standard, work-life balance, single parenting, and women's uncertain place in the modern world. She published 20 books, several of them bestsellers, and over 100 short stories, articles, and novel-length magazine serials. She also had brief but lucrative stints in Hollywood, and she worked for the New York-based movie studios in nearby Astoria. Her movie and book deals, as well as her divorces and run-ins with the law, regularly generated newspaper headlines. She was a world traveler, a partner in a rural Connecticut newspaper, an informant in a federal drug investigation, and a pilot in the Civil Aeronautics Administration during World War II. And I think that's an especially adorable picture of her there on the screen in her flying outfit. She had 4 husbands and as many exes, and for the most part was an unmarried mother with strong beliefs about child-rearing, which she shared with the reading public whenever given opportunity. So for the rest of our time together, I am going to explore Ursula Parrott's relationship to New York in life as well as on the printed page and the movie screen. So when she first arrived with Lindsay in the early 1920s, Greenwich Village had already been long considered a symbol of the repudiation of traditional values, as the writer Malcolm Cowley put it in his Remembrances of Life in the Village. Ursula very quickly took to and adopted a very New Yorker sensibility. She really became, to my mind, a quintessential New York writer. And 2 of my favorite examples of her emerging New Yorkness, if you will permit me to make up that word, come from her late 1920s private correspondence. The first was written, these are so succinct too. The first was written before she had published anything, and it appears in a letter she wrote to one of her post-marital lovers, the photographer and art collector Nicholas Murray. who had legendary parties in his MacDougal Street studio, which was frequented by the likes of Edna St. Vincent Millay, Sinclair Lewis, Eugene O'Neill, and Haywood Brown. Murray had recently broken up with Ursula, and in this letter, she describes how she had shed tears over him on the way to work that day. This is how she described it. Not very many tears, just 3 blocks north and 2 blocks east of tears. I think that's such a beautiful, succinct New York way to express grief in blocks. The second involves another ill-fated romance. This one's significantly more serious and devastating, with another New York journalist named Hugh O'Connor. O'Connor had signed a contract with Dial Press to write a book about the history of Greenwich Village, which I wish for all of our sakes he would have actually completed and published. And Parrott volunteered to help him conduct background research for it. One of the things she did was go to the New York Public Library to read old copies of the socialist magazine, The Masses, which she fell in love with. And this is how she described the magazine. It's like a New Yorker with the guts left in, which again, she really nails that, right? Sorry, New Yorker, if there's any New Yorker people out there. As was the case with Ex-Wife, Parrott published tales based on what she knew and experienced. And those 50 or so stories and novels that are set in New York City are fascinating as both quasi-autobiography and as sociological observation of the city at this time. So as I was thinking about this talk and going back through some of her writings, I was really struck by how literature can kind of over time function as a kind of historic preservation, right? Documenting places that are gone, behaviors that are gone. And I think the passages I'll be sharing with you today speak to this. And actually, one of my dreams is that I can interest a publisher in publishing a collection of these short Parrott stories, or at least in publishing another Parrott novel. So if I have any publishers out there, I'm very easy to find. Drop me a line. So Ursula Parrott's second novel, Strangers May Kiss, came out in 1930, and it contains some exceptionally interesting and adventurous writing about life in New York. As when the novel's long-suffering female protagonist imagines the city itself delivering her a pep talk at the end of the novel. She's had a rough go of it. This is the pep talk that New York City gives to the young woman protagonist. March on. It doesn't matter where or why. You had your fun, didn't you? It's finished. What of it, and who cares? March on. Don't block traffic. You had a broken heart? Forget it. Applesauce, bologna. March on. You're tired? Who isn't sometimes? March on. You didn't get what you want? Nobody does in the end. All things pass, some slowly, some fast. It don't matter. The parade's the thing. Watch the parade. The band keeps playing. Keep step. March on, baby. Somewhere or nowhere. In the end, you won't know the difference. If you don't want to look at tomorrow and you don't like today, hell, you had yesterday. And you can always watch the parade. When I came across this passage, I was blown away. I thought, this sounds like almost Beat in its sensibilities. And I love the idea of personifying New York in this way. I also want to say in this and in most of Parrott's stories, the female protagonist is successful and resilient, but undone by a man who is hypocritical and weak. Just a fact. So written in a stylish staccato beat, this sophisticated and witty rallying cry brims with the forward-thinking ethos that also carried its author through so many years of her roller coaster ride of a life. Although Parrott penned dozens of stories about the plight of successful career women, she published one novel-length work on the subject that is a tour de force. Told across 5 parts in Redbook magazine from October 1933 to February 1934, Breadwinner offers a wonderful snapshot of a time, place, New York City, and worldview. In it, Linda Ames and Mark Fenwick are newly in love in the fall of 1929, just a month before the stock market crash. Linda has been working for 4 years as a story reader at the Morgan Film Company, where she has just been promoted. Mark has been working in advertising at a salary that he imagines is about the same as Linda's. It's not, by the way, versus over dinner at New York's Central Park Casino, Linda tells Mark that she has just earned the impressive sum of $1,000 for an original movie story. Just 3 pages in, Parrott gives her readers a glimpse of what's to come as Mark thinks, "She's a bright little thing. I suppose she will do fairly well for herself, but I hope she does not evolve into one of those careerist women who look so impossibly self-sufficient." You can probably see where this story goes, but the way it gets there is intriguing. This is definitely not the first novel about male hypocrisy, but it might be the first modern novel about women's work-life balance or lack thereof. And it's very New York, I think, in this way. Linda works 9-hour days, spent at a higher pitch of nervous tension than Mark could possibly imagine, although she always looked fresh and helpless and decorative. Linda thinks about how tired she is in every installment of the story, sometimes repeatedly, as she receives salary increases and promotions that drive the story along. She works 10 hours a day, rushing home after work to dress and go out with Mark at night to all the hot spots in the city, and there's plenty of rich detail about place in this story as well. As the weather shifts to crisp October, Linda buys herself a mink coat, showing everyone that she has made it on her own. Welcome to the club of unhappy career women, the story implies. Please enjoy your fur coat. One of Parrott's specializations was really career women's stories, and they're not usually happy ones. And the ones she set in New York, to my mind, are the best. No doubt, because obviously the idea of women having careers in New York is really different than thinking about the idea of women having careers in the 1920s and 1930s in Iowa or Indiana or North Carolina, where I am. Another one of these great stories is Parrott's 1935 novel, Next Time We Live, which tells a very modern New York story of two career-hungry characters, Cicely and Christopher, who meet at a Princeton prom and elope to Greenwich Village in the early 1920s. Sound familiar? Their kindly Italian landlady, Mrs. Donato, who aids Christopher and Cicely as they elope and make their way through difficult early years together, is likely based on a similarly disposed landlady from this period in the Parrott's wedded life. The novel's portrait of a young marriage is also as close to a recounting of Lindsay and Kitty's romance as we are likely to find, and I'll just read you a short quote. They had met at a Princeton house party in the spring of his senior year, the year previous. They'd fallen in love to the beat of the newly fashionable saxophones with a desperateness rather unfashionable that year when the code was to be poised and nonchalant. Again, I think really beautiful descriptive language that captures the jazz age, right? So Christopher works as a cub reporter for the New York Morning Star, and Cicely visits him by train in New York, drinking and dancing at the Pirates' Den and the Greenwich Village Inn. One weekend, they decide that she will not leave the city, but rather stay in New York, marry him, and begin their ultimately tragic life together. Both eventually achieve top places in their respective fields, acting and journalism, but their demanding careers necessitate that they live on different continents, with Cicely raising their child essentially alone. This is where I need to amplify something really important about Parrott's celebrity as a segue to finishing my discussion of this book, which is that Parrott had 10 adaptations of her work made in Hollywood in her life. This image of her is with the typewriter is when she was in the Hollywood Hills during one of her working stints there. Most of these, as you can see, were produced in the 1930s. She also wrote many other scripts, and there's lots of reports of other films going into production. So the first of these films was The Divorcee, which was based on Ex-Wife and earned Norma Shearer her only Academy Award. So big deal. Parrott's words were spoken by many of the great and emerging stars of the day, including Humphrey Bogart, Cary Grant, John Gilbert, and Jimmy Stewart, whose first starring role was in an Ursula Parrott adaptation of the book that I've just been discussing, and that is Next Time We Love from 1936. It was marketed and it was made as Next Time We Love because the studio was concerned that people might mistakenly think Next Time We Live was a film about reincarnation. Ludicrous, but it's true. But in it, Margaret Sullivan plays Cicely to Jimmy Stewart's Christopher. And I'm going to show you a clip from this film that both distills the essence of the novel's ideas and also captures the spirit of life in New York for this young couple. This is the scene in which Margaret Sullivan, whose career on the stage is on the rise, breaks it to Jimmy Stewart that she wants to stay in New York and pursue her acting career instead of following him abroad for the sake of his career.
It's all about you're not going. Well, why? One thing is the money. Well, I got a good enough salary, and the living is very cheap over there.
Well, it isn't only the money, Doctor. After all, you're starting on a new job. You shouldn't have to have me on your mind.
I've done all right so far with you on my mind.
Yes, I know. Oh, don't talk about it tonight anyway.
What's the real reason you don't want to go?
I told you.
No, there's something else.
Well, it's the same reason that I don't want Arthur Jennings to give someone else my heart.
Are you kidding?
Well, after all, I did get good notices, and I had such a good start. It seems the same.
Oh. Yes, they were good notices, weren't they? Well, it's a good story. Newspaper man marries actress, paths diverge, and...
Who's that? I thought you were glad about my working.
Well, it was all right while we were waiting for a break.
You mean while you were waiting for a break? I think I'd like a drink, please. As long as you're supposed to be having a good time.
I think you've had about enough.
But if I hadn't known you, you wouldn't have known I'd had any. You're just being unreasonable.
I'm being perfectly reasonable. Well, it's my own fault. I should have known what would happen if I let you go on the stage. Well, encouraged you then. You couldn't help it if you got stage struck.
Stage struck? Me? How could I be stage struck when I'm already on the stage?
A couple of critics flatter you, and then you go crazy.
At last I see things in that true light.
What's that, a line from your new play?
Rich, would you mind lending me $1, please?
Certainly.
Thanks, I'll pay you back tomorrow.
Whew, quite a scene, huh? I adore this film. This is really a film worth seeking out. I've been trying to program it as I've traveled on my book tour whenever I can, because I find that even people who are really familiar with Hollywood history have not seen this film, and it is just excellent in every way. Ursula Parrott's brand was really exploring the double standard. I think you're probably picking that up by now. And this film captures that especially well. And I also think it is absolutely one of the most interesting and complex screen marriages I've ever seen represented in a movie, past or present. Starting in 1931, Parrott took several trips to Hollywood to work on scenarios and screenplays. She did not, however, like being in Hollywood. In a letter to her agent, she complained that she felt like she had died and waked up in a sort of gaudy hell, what with that California sunlight. Complaining about the California sunlight, I would say that's a very New Yorker thing to do. And I can share this with you because presumably most of you are in New York, and I apologize in advance to any Angelinos who jumped in this webinar. Ursula Parrott summed up her feelings about Hollywood and its denizens with a perfectly New Yorker quip: the best clothes and the worst conversations in the world. Ouch. I have another little Hollywood aside for you before I come back to New York. Thanks to one film that Ursula Parrott co-wrote called The Woman Accused, which came out in 1933, starring Nancy Carroll and Cary Grant, we have the only moving image footage that survives of the author herself. I would not take this opportunity to blink, or you might miss it. That's it. But that's all we have. I've been looking and hoping that a newsreel or something would turn up of a premiere, or anyhow, but that's it. So at least we get a small gesture from Ursula. Maybe one day I'll find more. The final short story excerpt that I'll share with you today is from a really fantastic Red Book story from 1938 called You Ride Success Alone. This moment in the story involves a successful female protagonist who is a magazine editor who is trying to get to an appointment in the city. And I will read Ursula's writing on this. The taxi moved very slowly downtown against the traffic. The driver seemed to feel that Fifth Avenue promised him the longest fare. She had time enough and did not bother to debate his best route for him. Besides, she hated to go downtown. She thought that those New York police regulations, which forbade known criminals to go below 14th Street, the general idea being to keep them away from the financial district, might well be extended to include all people more than 25 years old who had spent their youth in Greenwich Village for their own peace of mind. So, Ursula Parrott's fame and fortune, unfortunately, did not last. She struggled with physical and mental health. She struggled with alcoholism her entire adult life. And she also had a series of widely publicized scandals. And I think you have to give her credit, at least she liked to go big. The biggest scandal actually has a relationship to New York City, which is that in 1942, when Ursula Parrott was still married to her fourth and final husband, Colonel Alfred Coaster Schermerhorn, she had a widely publicized dalliance with a 20-something Private Michael Neely Bryan, who was a former guitar player in Benny Goodman's band. And this led to a military tribunal and to federal charges against Parrott for aiding and abetting, since Bryan had been awaiting charges for selling marijuana in New York City when his new friend Ursula drove him out of a military stockade for a night on the town. Her defense attorney argued that the author had actually been helping the government smash a drug band in New York. And as improbable as it seems, her FBI file corroborates that she did indeed cooperate with the Bureau of Narcotics agents in New York and Miami, and Ursula Parrott was found not guilty. This story is really incredible, and the New York part of it involves secret agents and this reefer den and this whole military drug connection. And keep in mind, this is during World War II, when the image of the American military needed to be very clean. And so they were going to really use this case as an example. Ursula Parrott was tried in a very serious fashion at a more kind of extreme level than anyone had ever been charged for something like this, for aiding and abetting, because of the kind of wartime activity and a desire to give the military a kind of serious kind of credibility. So in early 1943, from the St. Regis Hotel in New York City, Hollywood director George Cukor composed a handwritten note to the very well-known gossip columnist Hedda Hopper. On hiatus from Hollywood to aid the war effort by making training films for the Signal Corps, Cukor had just read an item in Hopper's column about how he was barracking in a suite of rooms at the St. Regis. Chiding her for revealing his high-class accommodations at a time of war, Cukor made what he called, with gentle humor, a final threat. He said, "If you don't praise me from the skies, if you are not wildly flattering about me, if you don't write glowing reports of my bravery and stoic heroism, I will go AWOL and say you aided and abetted me, and look where Ursula Parrott is now. So have a care." And I read that for a few reasons. One is to suggest to you the degree to which Parrott was just part of the fabric of the culture. In 1929, Ex-Wife was the water cooler book of the season. Parrott was in the paper all of the time for good reason as well as for bad. And so she was really a very prominent figure. She was in Hollywood. She was writing, columns about being a unmarried mother, about giving advice to career women, about explaining to men returning from World War II why they should pay more attention to their wives and let them work outside the home. So she was really in the swim. But she also really struggled in the decade after, in particular the decade after this Private Bryan incident. And she kept trying to come back, but she really hit rock bottom in the 1950s and died penniless and almost entirely without notice in 1957. This is about that image with the red pencil on it on the screen, which is just a tiny part of a larger column. I'll give you a chance to read that. That's about the only notice that appeared in the papers, despite all of the press, all of the columnist coverage, all of the headline stories. people would write stories about when she was down on her luck, but when she died, there was no attention to her, and not a single obituary. And I'm very happy to report that I will be publishing her first ever obituary as part of the New York Times Overlooked series. I hope it will be out the first quarter of this year, because I think it's really important to try to do what I can to put her back into the puzzle of New York City and of New York City writers. So a question I often get asked as I travel giving talks about her now is, why was she forgotten? Why were her novels and stories forgotten? And of course, this is not a simple thing to answer. I do talk about this some, of course, in the book. Alcoholism, financial mismanagement, scandal, these are hardly unique experiences for writers of the Jazz age, right? You know, Fitzgerald, which he's the obvious comparison to if you're talking about the Jazz age and writing about New York. Fitzgerald, all of these things check off all of the boxes. I think the main reason she was forgotten is actually fairly simple, which is that nobody tended to her legacy. And I want to end my talk by just saying a few things about differential legacy treatment. And I published an article about this last year in The Conversation, which is an online free public access periodical. So you can find this if you'd like to read it, because it's really about this question of Ex-Wife and The Great Gatsby, and why everyone has read The Great Gatsby over and over and over and over again, and why Ex-Wife has been out of print for so long, although Ex-Wife was in fact reprinted in 1989 and then went out of print again. So here are some facts about The Great Gatsby and Ex-Wife. The Great Gatsby sold 25% the number of copies as Ex-Wife when it was released. F. Scott Fitzgerald, however, had very influential advocates like Malcolm Cowley, who I've mentioned before, Lionel Trilling, Edmund Wilson, and they worked to get Gatsby republished when it fell out of print. They wrote articles and books about Gatsby and about Fitzgerald, and they also taught Fitzgerald's writing. During World War II, the Army sent 155,000 free copies of The Great Gatsby to American servicemen overseas, which is just extraordinary. That's a lot of books to put in the hands of a generation of future readers and teachers, right? When American libraries rolled out their first World War II era victory book campaign in the fall of 1942, they warned potential donors to desist from donating any women's love stories, listing Ursula Parrott along with Kathleen Norris, Faith Baldwin, and Eleanor Glynn as authors to be avoided. And I always like to point out to people that The Great Gatsby is a love story. Maybe it's a man's love story, but it is a love story. So my point here is that writers and books are not important. They're made important. And those of you who are really interested in the idea of historic preservation know that this is the same for historic preservation, right? Like, buildings aren't important. You have to get them designated. You have to advocate for them. You have to fight for them. You have to rally around them. So I will say, it's really quite hard to bring someone back into the conversation and into the canon. I'm doing my level best. I would love your help spreading the word about Ursula. I would love for you to buy and read my biography. I would love for you to post on social media or to do an online review of it at any place you do online reviews. These things are really helpful. I have a small book about a small subject in many ways, right? There's a lot of noise out there, and so everything helps. I would also love for you to read the McNally reprint of Ex-Wife. If you have friends who are teachers, please tell them to check it out. It would be so great alongside The Great Gatsby in an American literature class. I will also be doing in-person events in Miami and in Asheville in February and March, and I'll be doing an online event trying to convince high school teachers to start teaching Ursula Parrott's Ex-Wife for the National Humanities Center. That is a free webinar, and there's details about this and more at my website. And with that, I will say thank you so much, and I would love to answer your questions.
My camera not coming? Oh, there we go. All right. Thank you, Marcia. That was amazing. Thank you so much. So one of the questions we have is, how did you get interested in Ursula Parrott? How did you discover her?
Yeah.
Because, the fact that she had kind of faded away from this common memory. Yeah, how did you make this discovery?
Thank you for that question, whoever asked that question. So I found her through my straw man. I was at the University of South Carolina, of all places. I had been told, I was giving a talk there, and I was told that they had F. Scott Fitzgerald's unproduced Hollywood screenplays in the special collections there. They had acquired them. So I thought, wow, that's kind of wild. I'll go look at them. That's kind of interesting. So I looked at the finding aid. I had about an hour, and I was like, well, I'll pick the most interesting one. And there was one called Infidelity. I was like, that sounds pretty good. So um, you probably know where the story is going by now. So I start looking at the screenplay, and I see it's adapted from a story by Ursula Parrott. And I thought, well, who's Ursula Parrott? I've never heard of her. I wrote her name down. And for a couple of years, I actually thought I was going to write a book and try to republish these unproduced screenplays. And I just, I hit a brick wall dealing with studio legal departments, and I was doing all this research, but I was starting to kind of fill things out. And I was doing this research on Ursula Parrott. I got a copy of Ex-Wife on eBay, and I read it, and I thought, are you kidding me? Like, why haven't I read this book? And I asked my friends who are professors of American literature, oh, do you know about Ursula Parrott? No one, not one person had heard of her. And I had a moment, often I think those of us who spend our time doing projects like this, which are years in the making, and you never really know what their fate is going to be. I had a moment that just clicked. And I thought, you know what? The world doesn't need me to write a book about F. Scott Fitzgerald. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of books about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Ursula Parrott needs a book written about her. And if I don't do it, who is going to do it? No, she's just completely invisible. So it was this crazy Hollywood brought me to her. Fitzgerald brought me to her. So I'm grateful for that. And the story of Infidelity is actually really wonderful because Fitzgerald was really into the screenplay. He thought it was going to be great. He was writing it for Joan Crawford. He was writing it for MGM in 1938. And they could not get it past the Hays Code. They tried a little shell game where they changed the name to Fidelity from Infidelity. Just the way Ex-Wife was changed to the Divorcee, which was kind of classing it up, but nothing worked because ultimately it was a story about infidelity and forgiveness. And you couldn't do that, right? Like, according to Hollywood's in-house censorship, if you were unfaithful, there had to be a punishment or consequence, lonely, miserable, etc. Anyhow, sorry, I'm rambling. I get excited. So
No, that's an awesome story. I love the whole serendipity of just
yeah.
discovering it like that. So another question we have, who was Ursula Parrott's original editor and publishing house, and didn't they have any interest in keeping her legacy, her titles in the public memory?
Yeah, so it was Harrison Smith. So first all, I should say her agent was George By, who was also Eleanor Roosevelt's agent. I mean, he was agent to a ton of prominent, Lindbergh's agent, um, uh, Manhattan-based, seems like a really lovely person, was I think her only staunch friend and advocate who really stuck with her as long as he could. So Cape and Smith formed their own publishing company, and Ursula Parrott's book came out with them, and she published with them for a few years, and then she decamped for Longmans. But once people got their value out of her, no, publishing then as now, it's kind of it's a rough world. You're worth what your next story or your next book is worth. And I will say that that Parrott she was her kind of resiliency and optimism really I'm in awe of it because she hit rock bottom pretty hard in the 50s. But she got back in touch with her agency, and she she convinced someone there to represent her, and she was trying to write both her memoir, which I am devastated doesn't exist. I mean, maybe it's somewhere in an attic or a box, but it's probably, incinerated long ago. And she was also trying to write these Brooklyn stories. She found herself in Brooklyn when she was picking herself. She was in a halfway house and then in a low rent apartment in Brooklyn. And she was writing these Brooklyn stories that she, compared them to like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. In a rougher, non-high society style, very different world. And but she just couldn't, I don't think she could finish them, but she tried. But yes, so which is to say, no, but I will say this, let me say one more thing about that. Um, George by her agent kept every letter that she sent to him and copies of most of his letters to her. They are at the Columbia University Archives Special Collections. And I cannot tell you, when I found those, it was the biggest gift because, when someone dies penniless and obscure, they don't leave an archive. There's no Ursula Parrott archive I could go to. I had to put bits and pieces together of, fragments from this archive, that archive. So at least that correspondence survives.
Incredible. So much work, but what a lot of fun to do that treasure hunting in all those archives.
Absolutely.
We have a couple of questions about her son, like what happened to her son
Yeah.
ultimately, and what was his relationship with his mother and her legacy.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. So first off, Ursula Parrott really believed she was, I mean, she had a goal of being the best modern single parent, basically unmarried parent, just single parent wasn't a concept, that she could be. And to her, that meant a very Northeastern thing, which was boarding schools, the best, most expensive boarding schools, travel. So she loved to travel her son. She got the country house outside of the city in Connecticut, put in a pool, got him a horse. She had a never married sister who was older than her, who basically became her son Mark's primary caregiver when Ursula was in the city, staying, at whatever hotel she was staying at, when he wasn't in boarding school. And the thing she was proudest of, and I really do believe proudest of, was that she put her son through Harvard. So it could not have been easy being her son, in as much as all the tumult of her life, the alcoholism, the husbands, the bad decisions, the spending, um, uh, you know, that could not have been easy. But she was so proud that she put him through Harvard. She sent her agent, who was then her ex-agent, because he had finally said, like, look, we can't do this anymore. You're getting too erratic. Um, uh, a copy of his diploma, and was like, look what I did. And uh, the McNally edition of Ex-Wife reprints Mark Parrott's afterword, her son's afterword, which he did for the 1989, short-lived 1989 reprint of this book. It is a gem because he writes so beautifully about his mother, about his experience of her as an author and as a mother. And it's just it's thoughtful and it's moving. And I think he really, he has a great perspective on it. I don't know what their relationship was like in the end. I do know that Parrott, when she was trying to pick herself up in the end in the 1950s, she told her agent that he was not to tell anyone where she was. And she said that includes family. And the only family she had was her sister and her son. So I don't know if they even knew, where she was in the end. And the only reason I know that she died in a charity ward of a New York hospital is because Mark writes about it in the afterword to this book. I have never been able to find a death record of her, but she would sometimes use fake names when she checked into hospitals because she didn't want the gossip columnists to write about her.
Looking for another question. Oh yes. Okay. So the last film made based on her work was in 1956, which would have
Yes.
been towards the end of her life. Did that not get her any additional attention or credit or, help revive in any way a possible future career?
Yeah, no. I mean, first off, when you sell the rights, these contracts, like when she sold the rights to that movie in the 1930s, she got paid. That's it. So there's no like, she didn't get another check in the 50s. Douglas Sirk, who directed that film, There's Always Tomorrow, which is wonderful, with Barbara Stanwyck and Fred McMurray, about a career woman who never marries, has this great successful life as a fashion designer, and then a man who marries, has all these children, no one pays attention to him at home, and Parrott dangles the possibility of an affair between them when she comes back, because she's never had time for marriage and children, and then she doesn't let it happen. It's a very interesting story, and those of you who've seen either the 30s version or the 50s version know that. But no, there was no resurgence, no. And Parrott at that point was, at such a low point. This is really towards the end of her life that yeah, there was, I don't think she was even in a position she could have taken advantage of whatever little burst of publicity came from that, sadly.
Oh, all right, and I think this will be our final question for the evening. And you kind of hinted at it already previously, but do we know of any other unpublished works from Parrott? As you mentioned the Brooklyn stories, but are there any other things that we know
Yeah.
of?
So in terms of unpublished, well, so unpublished and lost are two different things, right? So actually one of the most heartbreaking stories is Parrott was staying at a hotel in New York in the early 1950s, and she couldn't pay her bill. And she was kind of going from place to place, staying with friends and moving around a lot. And, I write about this in the book that the news item I found about the detectives trying to chase her down basically interviews somebody who worked at the hotel, who said all she left behind was a typewriter and like a suitcase full of worthless paper. And I thought, well, that's where the stories are. And you know what probably happened to those, right? Like thrown away. Although this is my fantasy, right? Is that somebody was like, well, maybe let's not throw those away. And one day somebody will be doing some, preservation work in the basement of this hotel building, and we'll find a suitcase and go, oh, this looks interesting. Um, but sorry, I lost track. I went down a rabbit hole. But
Oh,
sorry, I taught my first class today at NC State, so I've had a long day. In answer to the other questions, so there are two bodies of significant correspondence. One is with George By, the other is with Hugh O'Connor, who was a lover and kind of her principal tormentor, but also she worked out a lot of her ideas about modernity, writing back and forth with him, even though they were painful lessons. That's the only unpublished writing of hers that I really know about, are these letters. I don't have a single story that wasn't published. What I have a lot of is stories and serialized novels that only exist as like, scans from historic magazines, right there. They've never been published. That's the stuff I really would love to publish as a collection, because I think the pitch is really New York City. This is like one of the great writers of New York City that nobody knows about, and she would be a great addition to the canon. But to my knowledge, there's no surviving unpublished work.
all right. Well, everyone listening tonight, let's keep a lookout for that suitcase with those papers. It's so enticing now that you've mentioned it, so fingers crossed.
I
But
know.
I've already seen in the comments here, people were absolutely blown away by this presentation, Marcia. So thank you so very much. This is an absolutely fascinating history. Everyone, thank you so much for joining tonight. I've put in the chat the links to Marcia's article, her book, and Ex-Wife by Ursula Parrott. So please go ahead, check those out. We're going to all go out and watch all those movies now based on Ursula Parrott's work as well, because who doesn't love watching good classic movies? Again, Marcia, thank you so much. This was absolutely fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you for
Folks will
having me.
be sent a follow-up email with the reporting as well. So thank you so much. Stay dry, everyone, tonight as well.